Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to the Horn of Africa. It's our All Things Horn of Africa, All Things Africa edition. And on the program, we'll be learning about Djibouti and who better to educate us about this country than Abayomi Azikiwe, the founder and contributor to Pan African Newswire. He's an independent journalist and historian coming to us from Detroit. He's a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. And yes, so let's get into it. So first off, Abayomi, welcome back to the program again.
It's always good to be back to discuss these very important issues that get very, very little attention in the corporate media.
Exactly, and even sometimes the best of the left often overlooks what's happening in the continent of Africa. So it's a real honor. So thank
Yes.
you so much for coming back. For coming back on to educate us about all of these different countries. And before we get into our before we talk about Djibouti, a reminder, folks, please help us grow the channel. And the only way to do that is if you like our videos, share widely both past and present and recent content One Plus One produces, and please support independent media by donating to One Plus One. One Plus One is entirely indie, so please donate to us generously if you can. And yes, and because that's because you're supporting independent media and it helps the channel grow. So, Abayomi, talk to us about Djibouti, and then actually the first thing I want you to talk to us when talking about Djibouti is talk to us about Djibouti prior to colonization and its relations, if it has any, with certain Islamic empires, and tell us both the good and the bad before French colonization.
Well, yes, it's very interesting history. It was a part of the ancient civilizations of Punt, along with Ethiopia and Somaliland. And that,
Oh,
of
interesting.
course, has a lot of citations in regard to historical civilizations in Africa and also in West Asia. In the 19th century, you had the intervention of France there. And in regard to Djibouti, they established a French colony, French Somaliland there. And it was part of the whole breakup of the Horn of Africa. You had the British, there were the Italians, and also the French. And then, of course, when the Berlin Conference was held, it was broken up. The people of Somalia were broken up into even more territories. But French Somaliland, after the demise of the period of French colonialism, between 1967 and 1977, it was established as a territory of Afars and Isas. These are the two main ethnic groups that make up the Djibouti nation. And then in 1977, the people voted for national independence. It's been an independent state since 1977. What makes it so important is its strategic location, having access to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, being close to very, very important shipping lanes, some of the most important shipping lanes internationally. So this is why this area is contested even up until this day.
Fascinating. Actually, and talk a bit more about French colonialism in Djibouti. How did France treat this particular colony, and what are some of the long-lasting negative impacts it continues to have on Djibouti? Because I'm going to make a wild assumption that France continues to play a very reactionary role in Djibouti affairs, the way France continues to play a reactionary role in African affairs and West Asian affairs in general. Correct? Oh, and Haitian affairs and Israeli affairs and whatnot, right?
Yeah, it's the classic divide and conquer and rule strategy. The two main groups there were pitted against each other. Eventually, during the post-independence process, this led to a civil war during the early 1990s, in which there were thousands upon thousands of casualties in the area. Eventually was resolved but it had a lot of damaging impact during the 1990s. This was taking place at the same time you had turmoil in other Horn of Africa states. For example, the collapse of the Workers' Party of Ethiopia government under Mengistu Haile Mariam. That took place in 91. You also had the collapse of Mohammed Siad Barre's government in the country of Somalia. And of course, Eritrea declared its own independence after the collapse of the Ethiopian government in 1991. Although Eritrea didn't become officially recognized as an independent state until 2 years later, that was in 1993. So despite the fact that there's only 1.1 million people that live in the country of Djibouti, the Republic of Djibouti, there's still divisions, and these divisions stem directly from the colonial project in the Horn of Africa. Those issues have largely been resolved. However, the country now is a major source of military outposts for a number of countries. First of all, the United States.
Actually,
But we need to go back.
before we get into that, because that's one of the
Right.
questions I had prepared, but I have to ask these two questions then, which is what led to the Djibouti civil war? What are some of the legacies of that? And where was Djibouti situated during the Cold War? And geo how did its geographic location affect its relation with the rest of the Horn of Africa, such as Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea, which you already alluded to?
Yeah, it was a conflict that led to the Civil War between the ruling party at the time, which was extremely dominant. It still is a dominant party today, and but they do have a multi-party system right now. So that eased a lot of tensions, but there was a tension over the post-independence rule, the character of that rule. And that's what led to the Civil War. The intense fighting lasted for about 3 years, although there were continuing clashes that took place for another 5 to 6 years. So it was a pretty devastating internal conflict. And I think that the French, for example, set it up initially as a military outpost. They had their own military forces there prior to the U.S. and the other countries that are there now.
Interesting. And did who did I mean were now when it comes to the international community, the Western world, who did they what faction did they support in the Djibouti civil war, out of curiosity?
Yeah, well, the French supported the government that was dominant at that time, and that was part of the ESAS ethnic groups. The party that dominated during that particular time period was important because they had the French backing, and of course, eventually, as a result of a number of diplomatic maneuvers and military assistance to the existing government at that time in Djibouti, they were able to prevail over the rebels. The rebels were from the Afars ethnic group, which is spread out. There are even communities in Ethiopia as well as in Djibouti. So the opposition party became known as the FRUD. And of course, the leading party, the People's Rally for Progress, is of course was part of the struggle for the liberation of the opposition groups that were involved in this struggle too. So Ismail Omar Guelleh, who came to power about 26 years ago, 1999, is still the president today, and he represents the dominant political party inside of Djibouti, even up until this period of 2025.
And is he generally pro-Western, or is he left-leaning, pan-Africanist, nationalist? Where does he lie on the political spectrum?
It's complicated, to say the least. This gets into the military alliances and the authority for various countries to establish military outposts in Djibouti. And of course, I
Okay.
mentioned France initially. Then the United States, with its combined joint task force, the Horn of Africa, which is a part of the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, uh, they do joint military exercises every year. But the U.S. has its largest military base in Africa is located in Djibouti. Now, it has thousands of troops, at least 3,500. France also has troops at this same base. It's called Camp Le Monet, and they have been conducting, using as a jumping off ground for operations in other parts of Africa, as well as in West Asia. Now, what's been really interesting about this over the last year and a half is the war in Gaza and the role of the Ansarullah in Yemen,
Yeah.
which is right across the Red Sea from Djibouti. They have denied U.S. Rights for carrying out operations in Yemen against the so-called Houthis or the Ansarullah, which is the resistance movement that's part of the axis of resistance, which is allied with Iran, which was allied with the people in Syria, Iraq, the Hezbollah, of course, in Lebanon,
Yeah.
and then in Gaza, the resistance forces in Gaza, which includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so forth. So they denied the U.S. rights to carry out strikes against Yemen. Now, the U.S. carried them out anyway, and so did Israel. But the point is that they do have a degree of sympathy and solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and those who are working alongside the Palestinians against the current genocide that is taking place in Gaza, as well as in the West Bank. So that's very interesting. But at the same time, prior to that, they allowed the U.S. to use their airspace, their landing space for strikes against what was considered Al Qaeda bases in Yemen. So it's quite a contradiction. On the one hand, they don't support what the U.S. is doing against Ansarullah, but at the same time, they have allowed the U.S. And given blessing to the U.S. strikes against other forces inside of Yemen.
That's fascinating. Well, I think you already kind of answered this question, which is after the Cold War, how do the U.S. and its allies continue to treat Djibouti? Is it one of respect for sovereignty or one of continuing neo-colonialism? Uh, would you like to answer that question before we talk
Yeah,
specifically about the
yeah,
base?
I think it's the neo-colonial construct is the most appropriate. That's how they
Okay.
wound up having those troops at Camp Le Monet. And I think that's very, very important to understand that the Cold War ostensibly ended sometime between 1989 and 1991. 89, of course, you had this domino effect of the collapse of the Comecon countries in Eastern Europe, what happened in the German Democratic Republic, what went down in Romania and other countries. And
And
then,
you
of
can
course, in
arguably
1990,
and you can arguably say that they were all color revolutions, the first of many color revolutions.
exactly. Yeah, we saw that definitely in the GDR in Romania during the last half of 1989. And then, of course, in 1991, you had the collapse of the USSR and the taking over of a neoliberal administration of Boris Yeltsin. And of course, things have changed a lot in the last 30, 34 years. But right now, in terms of Djibouti, the US is very concerned about China, which also has a military base in Djibouti. Now, this is very interesting. You have China, you have the United States, you have France, there's also Germany, Japan, and Italy. All of these states have, even Saudi Arabia, have military outlets in Djibouti. So it's become like
Wow.
a outpost for these various military powers. But the US is very concerned, though, about the presence of China and the potential for China utilizing the Horn of Africa to enhance its relationship with countries throughout the African continent and throughout West Asia as well.
Fascinating. Now, So that actually leads to this question, which is talk to us about the numerous bases of multiple nations on Djibouti. So as you mentioned, you have the Americans. I believe the Brits have troops there, the French, but even Italians, Japanese, Chinese, and Russians. What has been
Germany
the
too, interestingly enough,
Germany as well? And you mentioned Saudi
and
Arabia.
Japan.
So,
Yeah.
what has been the impact of each of these superpowers in Djibouti and the human rights abuses and impunity that comes with having, military bases?
Well, yes, we know the U.S., of course, has been utilizing it to carry out military operations in other parts of Africa. Of course, this has been extremely damaging to the people there. However, at the same time, there's a growing sentiment, anti-imperialist, militarist sentiment in Africa against the presence of both French and U.S. troops. We've seen this in the Sahel region, but it's also spread to other areas as well. So, despite the fact that for the last 17 years we've had the U.S. Africa Command in existence. In his actual headquarters is in Stuttgart, Germany.
Mm,
But the fact that they have a huge, relatively large military presence in Djibouti, of course, is a threat to the African continent. But despite this, uh, the sentiment, a lot of the sentiment now in certain parts of Africa is against U.S. military occupation. But at the same time, the U.S. is not letting up. For example, they just had a major military operation in the Horn of Africa in conjunction with the U.S. Africa Command. That took place just last month. There was a huge military operation in the Horn of Africa alongside U.S. Military troops. These operations take place every year. So, in regard to the U.S. position as it relates to the Horn of Africa, they are still committed to maintaining U.S. imperialist dominance in the Horn of Africa. And these military operations are evidence of that. And also, their continuing support to the state of Israel proves that they have no intention of withdrawing their forces unless they're absolutely asked to do so. And I don't see that happening right now, but who knows? Things have been moving fairly rapidly on the continent over the last couple of years. We saw what happened in Niger. It was a major outpost of U.S. imperialism in West Africa and the Sahel. They had drone stations there, and with all that uranium there, and it was no way the U.S. Was going to leave, but the government asked them to leave.
yeah.
So they said they have left. So in the same situation in Mali as well. So who knows what's going to happen in Djibouti over the next few years, because you have a lot of instability in the entire Horn of Africa region. That could have a lot to do with the status of U.S. troops. And at the same time, we don't know what the general atmosphere is going to be in the next several months, the next few years, in regard to the Horn of Africa and the sentiment there in regard to U.S. military involvement. The situation in West Asia, too, could be a major factor. Most Africans on the continent have sympathy for the Palestinian cause. They're anti-Zionist, but there's tremendous pressure, though, coming from the U.S. Even the current Trump administration has very much interest in what is going on in Djibouti.
Interesting. And before I ask this question about China and Russia, I have to ask this question in relation to U.S. bases, German bases, Italian bases, British bases, French bases, and so forth. Now, I know when the U.S. does what's called military drills and war games with on the bases they have in South Korea, the bases they have in Japan, primarily in Okinawa. There's been horrendous accidents when a fighter jet doesn't fly off the air, and then it crashes and kills many and kills many people. There's been horrific cases of U.S. Soldiers committing vile acts of sexual assault, sexual violence on the people of the Philippines, the people of Japan, and the people of South Korea themselves, and them never ever being held to account, especially if the rapes and whatnot, murders even happen on the actual bases that themselves. Are those kinds of systemic human rights abuses taking place on the bases in Djibouti? And I ask this because we've talked about Somalia a couple of times in our last several episodes, and I believe this with the whole Black Hawk Down anniversary and the propaganda of that incident taking place on Netflix right now, I was just reminded of the horrific human rights abuses Canadian soldiers did towards their Somali subjects. So I'm curious if those kind of human rights abuses and accidents, military accidents, happen in Djibouti itself.
Oh, we can assume that they do. They are very effective in covering them up. But yes, anytime you have U.S., French, or any imperialist country, they have soldiers. There's definitely going to be abuses of women, of children. So that is part of the entire process of U.S. occupation. We've seen it historically, and it will continue until those forces are asked to leave those particular states. But yes, there are abuses against civilians that are taking place anywhere in Africa where you have U.S. troops or U.S. backed troops.
And do you know? Do you know if China or Russia have engaged in gross human rights abuses like the Americans were, with respect to their military bases in Djibouti?
I'm not aware of it. In terms of China, no, I'm not aware of any human rights abuses so far. We try to monitor as much as we can in regard to the situation in Djibouti and throughout the entire region of the Horn of Africa. We have gotten reports over the last couple of days about migrants who are utilizing Djiboutian waters. There was 4 boats that capsized just a few days ago, and several people were killed. So yes, that problem of migration and under dangerous conditions is also a problem in the Horn of Africa as well.
Fascinating. And this is actually my final question, but I might have a follow up question to ask. But this is actually my final question, which is well, with the wave of anti-French and anti-imperialist actions and waves happening in Africa, the rise of BRICS, however imperfect, and China as a growing superpower, and efforts in the Horn of Africa to be peaceful and respectful to one another's sovereignty, which the West, we know, has been actively sabotaging. What is the future of Djibouti? Is it one of hope or bleakness, or at best a mixed bag and an uncertain one, given, again, the rise of BRICS and and those in the Horn of Africa trying to make peace with one another? So I'm very curious your response to that one.
I think because of its strategic location and the fact that they have not been solely encapsulated in U.S. imperialist involvement, the fact that there is some balance in regard to military relations, I think the outlook is hopeful for Djibouti and the Horn of Africa in general. And the major culprits in all of this, of course, the U.S. and are themselves in deep ideological, political, economic, and diplomatic crisis at this point. The U.S. Is following the Project 2025 framework. Trump, when he was running for office, the most recent period, said he had never heard of Project 2025. Well, we know that was not the case, because all the stuff that he's enacting since he's been in office over the last nearly 2 months is taken from that playbook, the Project 2025 playbook. they mention the fact that Djibouti, the fact that it hosts Chinese troops at its ports, are a threat. And they're very concerned about that. They also mentioned Somaliland, which we talked about during our last session as well, the potential for recognizing Somaliland as an independent state in exchange for U.S. Military presence in that area. So despite the fact that Trump in his state of the, in his address before the joint session of Congress just the other night, said that the U.S. should not be sending money to countries like Lesotho, for example, in Africa that nobody's ever heard of. These are outrageous statements that he made. Despite him making those statements, they are involved in continuing, attempting to continue their dominance of Africa, including the Horn of Africa. But to make a statement like countries that no one's never heard of, maybe he's never heard of it because of his lack of knowledge.
Exactly.
Who knows what his overall strategy is? We've been debating this here for the last few weeks. Is this guy really this stupid and uninformed, or is it part of a broader strategy of destroying the U.S. economy and then utilizing that as a mechanism for the full implementation of an authoritarian fascist state in the U.S. based upon this economic collapse? But we'll see what happens. We know that the markets have been down considerably over the last several days. And he has dismissed that, saying that these are just people who don't like what he's doing anyway. So I don't know who he's talking about, but it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. But in terms of the Project 2025, they do mention Djibouti and they do mention Somaliland as points of interest as far as U.S. imperialist hegemony and dominance are concerned. So I think if the people in Djibouti recognize this, they're going to become more and more anti-U.S. in their general outlook. And the same thing in regard to France, even though they're a former French colony. So I believe that eventually they will wake up and realize that the U.S. has nothing to offer them and that they can utilize their ports as a mechanism for their own internal economic development as opposed to the economic and political dominance of U.S. imperialism.
And just before we wrap up, I think it's also important if people are interested. My good friends at World Beyond War have a huge campaign trying to get all bases out of Djibouti. Their message is that Africa is not your playground. Although I don't agree with the thesis that China and Russia are both rival imperialists or rival capitalists in the continent of Africa, but that's another topic altogether for another day. But I know that the Black Alliance for Peace has also been campaigning to get U.S. and other Western imperialist forces out of Djibouti, and so all my luck to them and so forth. And actually, do you want to say anything about that before we?
They said that the U.S. has 900 military bases around the world. I mean, that's absolutely astonishing. And supposedly 40 of these outposts are on the African continent, with Djibouti, of course, Cap Lemonnier being the largest. So, yeah, it's a major problem. Now, Trump is trying to reconfigure this U.S. military presence and the U.S. dominance. He's doing it in regard to Europe. He's telling the European countries they have to spend more on defense. This, of course, is going to drive more people into impoverishment. We know what impact it's going to have in Britain and in France. But at the same time, I don't believe he's willing to relinquish the influence that the U.S. has now in Europe. I think it's a method of attempting to reconfigure the existing system to make the Europeans pay more for their military expenditures and also to pay more to the United States for their supposed help and assistance in the past. Like he told Zelensky last week that the U.S. had to be paid back for all this military assistance they've given to the Ukrainians. And he has yet to sign that statement turning over the rare earth minerals to the United States in exchange for their failed military policies vis-a-vis the Russian Federation. So it's going to be a very interesting period coming up in regard to the Horn of Africa and the role of the United States in their relations with that region of the world.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. And here's hoping that the campaigns of organizations like World Beyond War and Black Alliance for Peace and the African People's Socialist Party, here's hoping that all of those groups, their efforts in demilitarizing not just Djibouti, but all of Africa, do get, advanced, especially with this very, very erratic and volatile far right administration of the Trump administration. Well, we are joined on this edition of One Plus One, our all things front of Africa, learning about Djibouti with Abayomi Azikiwe. Let me remind folks, he's the founder and contributor to Pan African Newswire, independent journalist and historian, and he's also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, news commentary and analysis from a Black left perspective. Abayomi, thank you so much for taking the time. And the next country that we are going to be covering, since we're more or less done with the Horn of Africa, but the next country that we're going to be covering in our All Things Africa edition is going to be Kenya. And after we do Kenya, we're probably going to be covering all of Central Africa and the Sahel. So do join us for that. And Abayomi, again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and all my best to you until then.